Alright, so this time we're covering a classic, I suppose. Personally, I'm not as huge of a fan of his works as I used to be. Call me a hipster, I guess. But we'll be covering Edgar Allan Poe today. I'm sure he needs no introduction, but just in case, Poe was an American writer and poet. He was born in the 1800s and is known for his gothic fiction. His father left him when he was young, and his mother died when he was like 3, and he was raised, although never formally adopted, by John and Frances Allen. Eventually, he started writing poetry and critiques. He also worked as an editor in various literary journals, and is famous for his macabre poetry and short stories. I remember my past English literature instructors mentioning how he would sometimes go to his local poetry night at some club, get wasted on wine, and then trash talk people in prose or something like that, which was apparently very amusing. Anyway, I was thinking which of his works to cover for this, as he has many, many famous ones. The Raven, The Cask of Amontillado, The Telltale Heart, and so on, but I decided on a more grounded, quote-unquote, short story, Ligeia. Unlike most short stories that have a sort of beginning and end in the traditional sense, this one kind of goes on in chapters, per se, usually night by night, where it's just brief encounters with a body. Alright, so what happens? We start off with the narrator's wife, Rowena. He's never given a name, by the way. And she's been, well, dead in this dark and ebony chamber. So, a tomb. She is wrapped in bandages and drapes, which give her a charnel look. Charnel meaning something that resembles or is related to death. So, she literally looks like death, considering she is. While staring at her, the narrator feels this intense awe and thinks that he sees some faint signs of life coming from her corpse, like a subtle flush of color on her face or feeling a pulse under his fingers. He feels these signs for but a second before she goes back to being still. Over the next several nights, the narrator makes an attempt at reviving her, and each time he does, her body seems to stir, but the effect is temporary, as she reverts back to death shortly after. These signs give him a faint hope, and his obsession grows ever more, leading him to perform rituals and rely on opiates. He does eventually come to the conclusion that these visions of her movement are opium-induced, but he still continues to use it as he believes they might be genuine signs of a return to life. Throughout the story, the narrator is haunted by memories of Ligeia, the titular ex-lover who is also diseased, and that obsession further fuels his desire to see Rowena return. One night, however, he notices the corpse's eyelids opening slowly, and her face begins to show life once again, as color returns and her limbs are no longer rigid and tense. He believes Rowena has finally returned to him, as she rises with some feeble steps, her eyes open wide, and the air around her is thick with a strange scent, that of opium. The narrator gasps as his voice cracks while he sees her moving. He, of course, questions whether or not this is real. Could it be Rowena? Or could it possibly be Ligeia? He's unsure whether what appears before him is his lost love, or his long diseased one, as this could all be an opium-induced hallucination. The narrator is of course overwhelmed and claims that this must be her, as these are the full, black, and wild eyes of his lost love, the Lady Ligeia. So while he is convinced that he has witnessed a supernatural return of his long-lost lover, the poem ends abruptly, and vaguely, with no final confirmation on whether or not she did return, or if this was all in his head. It's a very peculiar story. One where, well, you have a deranged lover obsessed with his dead wife and being unable to move on, as with most of Poe's works. There's a ton of symbolism and imagery and so on. For example, at one point he sees or dreams, quote unquote, that he saw ruby-colored droplets fall into a goblet of wine that he was giving her. This could be just some metaphor for blood or tears, or how his attempts to revive the dead kind of echo this idea that love can also be magical in its own morbid way. It also reminded me about this old thrash metal band called Annihilator. They're from Canada, and they wrote a song about Ligeia back in 1989, and it basically tells the same story, just in 4 minutes with some sick guitar solos. There's actually even a bass solo in there at some point. Some of the lyrics are, "Sickness fell upon Ligeia, all knew she would die. Midnight came to lay her rest, farewell. Opium dreams, grief-stricken years, I took another bride, replacing that which I did have. Ligeia, why?" Still, it's a neato story, at least compared to his other works, in my opinion. It's a bit more obscure, quote-unquote, although his stories have been analyzed to death and back, no pun intended. So I hope you don't mind a cliche like Poe on this month of horror. Still, next week, we have one more tale of horror to cover. And what could it be, I wonder? Well, as always, I know, but you will need to find out. Until next time, my little pupil.